Hi, everyone. Welcome to the NASEO-NARUC Strengthening Solar Cybersecurity through the NASEO-NARUC Solar Cybersecurity Toolkit webinar. While we give it a minute for people to start trickling in, I wanted to say welcome. My name is Kirsten Ruklas. I'm Senior Managing Director with NASEO, and I'm joined by my colleague, Sarah Trent, Delaney Dixon, and my quasi-colleague, Jody Rains from NARUC, our sister organization. So I think we're reaching kind of our maximum quorum with participants, so we'll get started. Again, welcome to the NARUC and NASEO webinar on strengthening the solar cybersecurity through the NASEO-NARUC Solar Cybersecurity Toolkit webinar, where we'll delve into the work that we've been doing, the two organizations have been doing over the past few years on solar cybersecurity. Next slide, please. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. The webinar is recorded. Any kind of question that you would like to pose, please put in the Q&A box. We will have ample time at the end of the webinar to go over the questions and answers. This project is something we will refer to during the webinar as CATS. It actually stands for the Cybersecurity Advisory Team for State Solar. And it's a project that was implemented or is being implemented by the National Association of State Energy Officials, NASEO, with the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, NARUC. And really, the impetus of the project was to address cybersecurity risk and consequences in solar energy development. We are very fortunate to have the support of the U.S. Department of Energy Solar Energy Technologies Office, SETO. And we had a really great advisory group from our state members. We'll talk about all those items in a minute, but I wanted to say thank you both to SETO as well to our state members, both from the NARUC and the NASEO side, for really shaping this project. So today we'll talk briefly about the role of decision makers in cybersecurity and the impetus of why we started this project. We'll talk a little bit about the project structure and overview, which included some needs assessment and project roadmap, but we will spend the bulk of the time on our tools and toolkit, which were really the heart of the project and which been developed and recently released at the end of September. And then, as I mentioned before, we'll have some time for question and answers at the end. So I encourage you throughout the webinar, just drop your questions into the Q&A box and we'll get to them at the end. Next slide, please. So just briefly, who is NASEO? We are the National Association of State Energy Officials. We're the only national nonprofit associations for the governor-designated energy officials from each of the 56 states and territories. And we really serve as a resource for and about the State Energy Office through topical committees ranging from all kinds of energy-related topic, energy security, electricity, transportation, buildings, and so forth. We have regional dialogues and informational events that facilitate the peer-to-peer learning and best practice sharing from our members. We also advance the interests of our members before Congress and the administration. And feel free to check out NASEO at the website. We will share the slides after this webinar, as well as the recording if you have any questions about NASEO. We are guided by a NASEO board of directors, which you can see there on the right. And I'll turn it over to Jody to talk about NARUC on the next slide.
Thank you, Kirsten. Hi, I'm Jody Rains with NARUC. And a little bit about NARUC. We're a national nonprofit membership organization. We include all 50 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. And most of the state commissioners are appointed to their positions by their governor or legislature, but some commissioners in 11 states are elected by the public, and in 2 states by the General Assembly. Our mission is to serve the public interest by improving the quality and effectiveness of public regulatory regulation. Under state laws, NARUC's members have the obligation to ensure the establishment and maintenance of utility services as may be required by law, and to ensure that such services are provided by rates and conditions that are fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory for all consumers. We also have a board of directors, as you can see here, and we are involved very closely with NASEO because some of our utility commissions are also energy offices. So With that, I'll hand it back to you, Kirsten.
Thank you, Jody. So I really wanted to set the scene before we delve into the toolkit and why we undertook this project and what some of the kind of framing considerations were. Why should any of this matter to our members, the state energy offices and public utility commissions? So really, the state energy offices and public utility commissions have a huge role in cybersecurity, regardless of solar cybersecurity specifically or cybersecurity in general. They support public-private cyber risk mitigation and resiliency. They fund resilience projects and analysis. If you recall, for example, the IIJ 4101D grants to the states run through the majority of the state energy offices. They review and approve investments on utility cybersecurity for investor-owned utilities. That is certainly the public utility commissions. They coordinate with state and federal energy intelligence and emergency management entities. They provide analysis of real and potential energy sector disruptions caused by natural disasters, but also cyber attacks to policymakers and governors. And they really work on responding to a cyber attack which affects the energy infrastructure through consequence management. You will call the Colonial Pipeline attack. That was one instance where the state energy offices and public utility commissions and certainly emergency management agencies in the states affected really work together with a federal agency in responding to the cyber attack. Next slide, please. So the power grid is really in the midst of a historic and transformational change. State and federal climate goals nationwide, federal legislation is really leading to the rapid adoption of clean energy, and solar PV, solar power is certainly one of the clean energies that is part of this transition. PV systems play an active role in electric grid stabilization, reliability, and system level energy efficiency via two-way communications between aggregators and grid operators, usually over the public internet. So a lot of these benefits, though, also come with risks, right? Particularly around the potential of cybersecurity attacks. And a lot of work has gone in, but there's still a lot of work to do in addressing some of these cyber security concerns. So as stewards for planning and funding, as I outlined in the previous slides, both for investor-owned utilities, but also for state and federal funding, state energy offices and public utility commissions are really at the forefront of understanding and implementing some of these cybersecurity mitigation measures. So that was really the impetus of the CATS project. So the project goals and objectives was to convene our members, the state energy office directors and public utility commissioners, to identify the challenges, priorities, and mitigative actions in addressing solar cybersecurity, to then enable critical strategies and solution pathways for our members to enhance the security of the solar systems, to facilitate the discussions between state energy officials and solar and cybersecurity experts, and really create new relationships between the private sector, the state entities, as well as the federal government, to create collaborative frameworks and model approaches that can be easily replicated by other states. We did this through kind of a process, and I'll go over the process in a little bit, but really it was to educate our members, to create these collaborative frameworks, and then identify pathways for state decision makers to enhance solar cybersecurity, and then facilitate and create these stronger interconnections I mentioned before. Next slide, please. Who participates still in CATS? We have robust state participation. You'll see we have several states where the state energy offices are participating. We have several states where the public utility commissions are participating. And then we have several states where both state energy offices and PUCs are members. And it really ranges from all across the country's different forms of state energy offices, different sizes of PUCs and structures and market structures. So it was really a big geographic and otherwise diverse group that we brought together. Next slide, please. And then the key component of CATS is that it didn't only bring together our members, that was certainly important, but it also brought key partners and industry members through the CATS advisory group together. So we had participation from all of these organizations that you see on the slides: consumer-owned utilities, investor-owned utilities, the solar private companies, their trade associations, the Department of Energy, and some of the laboratories and standard setting organizations. So really a robust group of people who shaped this project. Next slide, please. So just quickly on the project timeline and structure, this has been a 4-year project. And in the beginning, we really just did a lot of discussions on state needs and what the states, our members, wanted to get out of this project. We incorporated the industry perspective, and then we developed a roadmap of potential tools, which I will talk about in a minute. We then decided, or then went to the tool development stage by creating a prioritization of tools and really working with our members to refine the tools and make sure they met our members' identified need. And now we're in the third phase of dissemination and outreach, where we do webinars like these, where we educate and provide information on the project, create a network, hopefully, going forward, and establish a continued feedback loop. Because while we're very proud of what we've accomplished under this project, there's certainly a lot more to do. And I think there's a really big focus on solar and DER cybersecurity, and rightly so, and will continue going forward. And we're really hoping that this project will be a catalyst and continue to provide value. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, we started this project with a needs assessment. Next slide, please. And the needs assessment really kind of honed in on what the goals that the states had with this project were. So the goals identified by the states were to develop their internal capabilities to better implement state policy and regulations and engage with the industry. I think when we started this project, DER cybersecurity was a little bit still new. I would say it probably has changed quite a bit, and not that many people were talking about it. So there was a huge impetus and huge need voiced by our state members for education. They wanted to assure resilience while meeting mandated clean energy and climate goals, which cannot be achieved without prolific solar and distributed energy resource deployment. I think one of our members at some meetings said it best. He was like, we really want to implement clean energy goals, but we don't want to make the grid less safe. So how can we implement clean energy goals and maintain a reliable and resilient grid? And then there was really a kind of a question or a desire from our state members to identify, analyze, and communicate opportunities for action to other state agencies, legislators, and really understand how relevant state policies and regulations can be shaped to account and mitigate cybersecurity risks for DERs. Next slide, please. So just a sort of a summary, but also just a little extension of what I just said. So really the kind of core tools that we started to develop fell in the 3 buckets identified by the states as needs, which is solar cybersecurity education for our members, understanding kind of the cost recovery and valuation needs when it comes to solar cybersecurity, and receiving and understanding kind of the policy and regulation landscape and guidance. Next slide, please. So we then grouped some of the state needs assessment into these 3 buckets that I talked about. And so the identification from our state members was they would like some resources and DER and cybersecurity measures, what has happened in the past, what's out there, what are some relevant standards, what is the role in setting standards, what are federal and state policy and regulations, what are the role of state energy offices and PUCs in solar cybersecurity, and really kind of a standard, like a level setting of what the current state of DER security and landscape of research is. Additionally, I think there was a concern, what is sort of the impact and consequence of cybersecurity risks in the solar landscape? If one PV array on a roof fails, is that impactful? What does it matter what roof it is, if it's a hospital, if it's another critical infrastructure? So really, what are the impacts and consequences that we're thinking of or talking about when we're talking about solar cybersecurity risks? Next slide. Then, especially from, I think, the PUC side, this question on cost recovery and valuation needs. What are the appropriate cost recovery mechanisms for some of the investments that need to be taken on solar cybersecurity? If things need to be upgraded, if there's additional deployment of technology that needs to happen in order to ensure solar cybersecurity improvements. So what is really the role of cybersecurity in utility rate making, and how would standards, changing standards impact cost recovery, and really a sort of broad understanding of rate recovery mechanisms and alternatives to rate cases when it comes to cybersecurity. Next slide, please. In terms of policy and regulatory guidance, the states identified some of the workforce considerations. Some were looking to have models and state examples of roles and responsibilities, guidance on state and federal responsibilities, guidance on how to engage utilities, and you'll see all this reflected in the tools that we're outlining today. And engagement of states and standards and incentives, as well as an identification of appropriate solutions, and having open conversations about cybersecurity. Certainly, these cybersecurity issues, not just in solar, but in general, are complicated, and they're also very sensitive. So how do you have conversations with utilities, other agencies on some of these really, thorny, touchy subjects? Next slide, please. So going forward, as a second step, we developed a project roadmap. Next slide, please. And this project roadmap then grouped the tools that we will discuss today. So as I said before, the need for education. So we developed a lot of educational tools for state energy offices and public utilities. We created tools for state organizations to convene and strategize. And we really wanted to, with the tools that you hear about today, provide solution examples to states. So again, in the vein of best practice sharing and peer-to-peer learning, a lot of the tools include examples of what has happened on the state level in other states, so that states can then, look at those examples and adapt them to their own state context. Next slide, please. So without further ado, we're now going to talk about the CATS toolkit, and I will turn it over to Sarah.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Trent, Energy Resilience Program Manager here at NASEO. Kirsten did a great job of kind of providing the impetus and how we came about deciding to do this project. And now the main part is the toolkit that was released September 29th. There's 11 tools in total, which we refer to as the toolkit. And myself and Kirsten and Jody are going to go through each of them, kind of discussing some of the content, the objectives, and what we were thinking going through and how they can be useful for you folks. Before I move on to the next slide, I do want to mention that when we're thinking of the toolkit broadly, think of this just as a foundational educational resource for you, for your office, to ideally get you to understand how solar cybersecurity looks, where it's going in the future, as well as some mitigative actions that your office can take to reduce that cybersecurity risk to infrastructure and how you can work with your private sector partners. Next slide. So the first tool, as the name kind of implies, the user guide serves as a roadmap for the other tools, kind of providing some context on the foundation of the CATS project, framing this issue of solar cybersecurity in plain terms, a lot of which Kirsten covered with the roadmap and with the needs assessment and the folks that we worked with the advisory group. Now, going into the content of the user guide, going into the content of the user guide, you can see that you'll see when you read it that there's 11 tools out there. I will mention that they're about 10 to 12 pages on average, so not super long, definitely digestible, but in this tool, it provides an overview of some of the content. So in 3 to 4 sentences, describes which tools might be most useful for you, and obviously depending on your roles and responsibilities, you can pick and choose there. But obviously encourage everyone to read all of them. And also in this tool includes the suggested order to read them. Delaney, if you don't mind just going back one more slide. I do want to mention that the tools can be broken up into two distinct buckets. The first bucket, which is the top row, is the education and risk awareness resources, which is tools 1 through 5. And then the second row being approachable and immediate actions that states can take to support cybersecurity for PV systems. Next slide. One more. Thank you. So the next tool is the photovoltaic solar engineering and systems overview. This is a fundamental overview of some of the most relevant and critical physical components. So discussing things like smart meters, data acquisition systems, and string combiners. And if those terms are unfamiliar or you're wondering what they connect to, this is the tool to start with. And this is why we encourage folks to start with this tool, because it introduces some really key terminology. And beyond that, some risk information that's really important that builds upon in other tools. Next slide. So going into the content, we took a screen grab here. This is from one of the graphics on the tool, but it simply is a simplified schematic. It basically depicts the local solar PV components and some of the interdependencies between the electric connection and the communication, while also identifying the physical and virtual risks, delineating that. So you'll see in the right-hand corner, the risks in red, obviously, that's going to have a big impact, as opposed to the solar panels that, if you hit those, likely all it's going to disrupt is the connection of the generation. Beyond that, each of these tools here, there's 12 in total. We go through each component and describe who the asset owners of these components are, some of the background of what these things do, as well as the vulnerabilities that lie within, and finally rating that grid to risk stability, which you can see on the right-hand side. Now, I think Kirsten described it well. Like, state energy offices and PUCs have a lot of have a clear role in this space, but I will say we aren't the ones that are to be on the keyboard typing away, fighting a cyber attack. But it's really good to know these basic information so you're able to connect partners and be able to discuss these issues. And I'll throw it over to Kirsten.
Thank you, Sarah. And I will say, I think with all of these tools, and I highly encourage to start with the first guide that Sarah mentioned. We really am hoping to provide resources to a broad audience of state energy offices and PUCs, so the ones that are very familiar with some of these, ideas and components, as well as some of the state energy offices and PUCs that might not be as familiar. So hopefully, each group will find value in any of these tools, and you can kind of find the tool that matches your skill level and familiarity with some of these. Next slide. So one of the components that was asked for by the state advisory group, or the advisory group and the state members in particular, a lot was the standards quick guide. So there was a big kind of question mark on what standards are out there. How are they enforced? Are they industry standards? Are they federal standards? How would they apply to the state? Are states just asked to implement some of these standards? How does this all relate? So we came up, or we drafted, put together this tool, the Standards Quick Guide, and it outlines different types of standards, industry standards, which ones are enforceable, which ones are just voluntary standards, and conceptualize the relevant cybersecurity standards and studies. It is one of the educational tools that Sarah mentioned. And if you go to this next slide, you'll see it's sort of set up by organizing these standards by the organization that put it out, then what is the standard called, and what is the relevance for solar cybersecurity, because there are certain standards that are maybe cybersecurity standards, but they don't cover or touch DERs or solar. And then there are other standards that maybe come of it added from a little bit more the solar side and the DER side. So this tool describes each of these standards, the relevance of code standards and frameworks to the solar value chain, and that is really ranked based on several criteria, including the direct applicability to solar assets, the industry acceptance of the standard, the completeness of the standard, the scope, how is it enforced, the maturity of the standard, and the influence on other standards, because it's all very much interconnected. And we are hoping that the users may use this quick guide as a tool to enhance their understanding of existing standards, and also for brainstorming new ideas to help states improve the cybersecurity of solar energy by really understanding what standards apply to their jurisdictions, what the gaps might be, and potentially how those gaps can be filled. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jody.
Thank you. And that may leave you with a lot of questions, and we get that, because obviously we need to have questions. And one of the tools that was created is asking questions of the utilities with regard to what their cyber profile is. So this tool is based upon the NIST standard, the NIST framework, and the pillars of the NIST framework, which include identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And what this tool helps with is it'll enable you to engage with utilities and ask the appropriate questions. What kind of projects that they have, what their interconnection is, and it just kind of leads you through a conversation. Can I have the next slide, please? So you have an idea what. Okay, so you'll see on the right side, it is showing you the protect bucket, and it gives you a list of questions. And this is loosely along the same lines for those of you who are familiar with the NARUC Cybersecurity Preparedness and Evaluation Tool, which is a series of questions that we encourage you to ask your utilities to find out where they are within the C2M2 matrix. This is a bunch of prompts, discussion prompts, so you can explore aspects of your utility cybersecurity, their risk management programs, and how they target their solar devices, systems, and communication pathways. Obviously, this list is not exhaustive, but it at least gives you a start with knowing what questions to ask. And I will turn it back to Sarah.
So the next tool is the hypothetical solar cyber attack scenarios and impacts. This is the last tool of the education and risk awareness resource bucket that I mentioned previously. The intention here is to offer a tool that talks about plausible scenarios of cyber attacks affecting solar PV assets and interconnected infrastructure. Obviously, when you're dealing with incident response, it's good to know potentially how things break before it happens. So that's pretty much the intention here. The objective being obviously to educate our members on these consequences. And further on in the next slide, I'll cover some of the actions that we provide, some actions that can be implemented to mitigate the risk in the future. So as I mentioned, the risk scenarios. So we cover 4 of them total in the tool, and they are switched up based on the attack type and the component targeted. But essentially, we're providing a resource that explores the stakeholders that are impacted by these scenarios, whether that's utilities, aggregators, residential customers, and then the consequences of that impact on infrastructure, followed by that followed by that potential actions to alleviate the risk. So that bottom piece right there. So for this example you see on the screen, this was taken straight from the resource, but is a distributed denial of service on a remote terminal unit. So we have a real world reference. This particular example dates back to March of 2019. So you'll see something similar as you go through, but really just an educational resource for you all to think about the impacts if these things happen. And the last thing before I'll pass it over is this resource should be referred in conjunction with the exercise design guidance for solar cybersecurity, a tool that Jody will be covering. I think a lot of people can see the clear connection, obviously, between scenarios and exercises. So this can definitely assist if you're interested. Next slide.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'll take it over for the decision support tool. So this is the first tool that's kind of part of the second category that Sarah mentioned. So now moving from the educational tool to a little bit more the action-oriented tools, as we want to call them, that kind of highlight approachable, practical, and immediate actions that states can take to support solar cybersecurity for PV systems. And I will note, and I should probably have said that from the outset, but while this project has been really focused on solar cybersecurity, a lot of what we're talking about today and in these tools is broadly applicable to DERs in general, so other distributed energy resources, not just solar. So this tool tries to help users address 4 discrete challenges: the complex requirements of relevant codes and standards. So once you've gone through the codes and standards guide, it kind of puts these codes into context. It talks about the technical complexity of solar assets. So each physical or digital component that plays an essential role in solar energy. So again, pulling from some of the earlier tools. It then talks about the cyber risk severity and how to gain and develop a clear understanding of cyber risk. So pulling in some of the information that Sarah just outlined in the previous tool. And then really looks at what kind of roles and responsibilities public, private, and nonprofit actors have, and how they can address some of these things outlined, the risks outlined earlier, and how, standards and some of the technology components can work hand in hand to do so. If you go to the next slide, please. This is a snapshot from the tool, and it really just outlines kind of the components of the tool. So we have resources. It has a policy quick guide, an engineering overview, again, the cyber attack scenarios. So all providing background information on the current policy landscape, the solar energy components, and what kind of risk we're talking about. And then it really goes into the decision support. So how does it do it? It identifies the risk owners, who owns the risk, who owns the asset. It compares code standards and regulations as potential solutions, and really provides some idea on state policies and processes to maximize the risk mitigation and minimize the risk, and how to implement those. Part of that is also the risk assessment. So a comparative analysis of cyber attack risks that affect solar PV components, so that users, state energy offices, and PUCs, as well as the private sector, can help understand how to prioritize policy to highest risk. So how do we assess the risk? What does that mean? How do we score the risks? And then through a probabilistic risk assessment result, how do we then pivot to implementation? The decision support tool allows the user to access the elements of the resource individually or as part of an integrated process. So again, it kind of tries to pick up states where they're at, and you can either use it, sort of the each individual component, or you can use it as an integrated process. And really a key component of the tool is the probable risk assessment, which is based on established formal variables, models, and consequences, which helps users understand the determined risk and assign ownership of the physical component that were listed before in the engineering system and risk ownership overview. So really honing in on what kind of risk are we talking about, and how can we mitigate it. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarah.
So this next tool, it's all about case studies. I think a lot of people obviously have been a part of, not case studies, all about working groups. I think a lot of people have been part of a working group, and it can be a really easy first step just to get the right folks in the room to discuss issues, in this case, cybersecurity for DERs or solar. So this tool outlines some actions that states can take to establishing that state level working group to discuss these issues. The objectives obviously will vary depending on what you're looking for with this working group, but we do cover some things that I'll cover in a little bit, but kind of providing technical knowledge, bringing the right folks in the room is some of the benefits, as well as engaging a variety of stakeholders and an opportunity to strategize. But the ultimate hope with leading these working groups and setting these up is to develop a task force to make these more formal recommendations, policy recommendations, whether that's to policymakers or regulators, and then creating some incident response plans or strategies. So this resource outlines, again, potential approaches that states can take to establishing state level working groups. In the tool, we cover 2 working groups, smart inverter working groups, which look into research and the development of smart inverters needed for integrating into DERs. And the second one being Homeland Security working groups, which is more on that mitigative front of how would we respond if this happened, or how can we mitigate in advance. The main part of this tool is the 2 case studies that are highlighted. So we have one from California and Hawaii, and how we kind of break down how they approach standing up their working group, what their objectives have been, what do they continue to be, because these are ongoing. and then the folks they invited to the circle, who was coming in and who were they chatting with, as well as some of the challenges they faced. So just to give you a quick preview, California is a part of that smart inverter working group that they set up. And if you read through the standards guide, you'll be familiar with IEEE 1547. They have a similar standard, which is Rule 21. So in this case study, we basically highlight how they're discussing updates to Rule 21, in particular with DERs. This is a long process they've gone through that's been broken up into 3 phases that has continued. So I will pass it over to Jody.
Thanks, Sarah. So obviously, there are more unfulfilled cybersecurity jobs than there are well-trained, skilled people to fill them. Regardless of industry sector, demand is growing rapidly. This tool identifies workforce competencies and requisite skill sets for the solar cybersecurity workforce and highlights tactics that state energy offices and public utility commissions can employ to amplify current solar workforce training initiatives and build partnerships that help develop this workforce. Next slide, please. One of the cool things about this tool is that it breaks down each category. And by category, what we're talking about is there are main categories within cybersecurity that need to be fulfilled. Namely, those are analyzing, collecting and operating, investigating, operating and maintaining, overseeing and governing, protect and defend, and securely provision. And within those categories, they're broken down into 33 specialty areas. Those are all contained within the NICE workforce framework. And what's really kind of cool is this tool now then breaks down each of those subcategories and gives you a check mark, where the check marks mean if the skill sets are likely needed or if they're helpful. Furthermore, within the tool itself, it gives you ideas of where you can go for additional training. It gives you ideas of where you can look for workforce, people who are being trained already. But it also identifies the internal solar cybersecurity expertise that state energy offices and public utility commissions should consider further developing to better perform their roles and responsibilities in this space, including clean energy policy, goal setting, utility investment analysis, and decision-making and regulatory oversight. So this is an incredibly helpful tool. And with that, I will hand it back to Sarah.
So the procurement guide is a tool that provides an overview of some of the existing procurement language that's out there that prioritizes cybersecurity language. Kirsten mentioned it, but there is a ton of federal funding coming down to the states. I don't need to tell you all that. But between the IIJA, the IRA, and then obviously the annual SEP funds coming down, there's a lot to do with deploying solar and DERs largely. So through this tool, really encouraging and keeping states cognizant of the fact that ensuring that these projects are prioritizing cybersecurity, whether that's in the state procurement or the solicitation of these assets. It's also important to note that it's not only considering the physical components where the vulnerabilities lie, but also how you are getting these assets, during spending the money, as well as who's installing these, are considerations that are included in this tool. So next slide. So going into the content of the tool a little bit, while the examples in this tool are not explicitly specific to solar and DERs, the language can be readily applied to state solar cybersecurity practice. So more just cybersecurity broadly, but obviously can relate to solar. So some different sections I'll just highlight here are, we talk about some federal landscape, highlighting some executive orders that relate, as well as cybersecurity specific procurement guidance set forth by PNNL, Department of Energy National Lab, as well as some maturity models for certification. So when people are contracting with you, contracting with other folks like utilities, making sure these people are meeting minimum standards or creating these standards for cybersecurity and have these cybersecurity considerations up front. So the the image you'll see on the right-hand side is a cybersecurity considerations for procurement process decision tree. This was just one of the things we mentioned in the tool. I just wanted to pull it out because this one's one of my favorites, but this in particular was developed by the Department of Energy to encourage and recognize that cybersecurity during the procurement process. So As you go through this tool, you go through yes or no questions as you are deciding, whether you need to, eventually at the end, you basically decide whether you need to confer with a cybersecurity professional during the acquisition of these equipment or systems or services. And I mentioned this just to say, you have to do your own looking for these, you'll have to do the looking, but there's a bunch of different programs that we highlight. But I think it's important to highlight here that establishing these proactive state protocols and also this signaling to industry and partners that cybersecurity is top of mind for states when it comes to procurement. Next slide.
I think that's me, Sarah. Okay, a little bit about exercise. Once you already have the plan, once you know what your utilities, what your solar systems are doing, now you need to exercise. And the exercise design guidance for solar cybersecurity provides recommendations on how your state offices, public utility commissions might design an energy emergency exercise drill or other simulation, focused on solar cybersecurity scenarios. This tool should be referenced in conjunction with the Solar Cyber Attack Consequence Scenarios tool, which Sarah had mentioned earlier. But additionally, for background, it's helpful to know that this is loosely based upon the HCEP, or Homeland Security Exercise and Evaluation Program, which was developed by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and also the NARUC Cybersecurity Tabletop Exercise Guide, which you'll find on the NARUC website. The target audience are exercise practitioners, planners, or facilitators interested in exploring solar cybersecurity incident response, preparedness, recovery, or mitigation. This is an advanced supplementary resource for persons or entities with prior exercise experience and knowledge based on a set of standard concepts, terms, and procedures that are common among the exercise community. Next slide, please. You may be familiar with seminars, workshops, and tabletop exercises. Well, this tool provides numerous sample scenarios, exercise objectives, potential participants, players, and sample discussion questions to pose during the exercise. And as I mentioned earlier, you could use this in conjunction with the hypothetical solar cyber attack scenarios that Sarah had mentioned earlier. Thank you. Next, I hand it back to Sarah.
And the last thing I'll mention, just going back to Jody's slide a little bit, consider this, this is not considered an exercise 101 type document. So it's good just knowing this going in. If you're looking for a 101, I would encourage you to look at NARUC's resources. There's some other resources out there, but having the basis of the exercise terminology, this is a good starting spot for you. So covering the final tool, the 11th tool, the state legislative options to enhance solar cybersecurity. It's clear that cybersecurity attacks are a credible threat to, in particular, DERs and other infrastructure out there. What we found when going through this, the process of writing this tool was there is really not a large effort to pass legislation designed to enhance cybersecurity specifically for DERs. Instead, what we found was there's more of a focus on cyber threats to the entire energy system broadly. So with the material that was out there, we did want to pull it together, but all that to say is we wanted to create a tool that outlines some relevant state cybersecurity legislative examples that do apply to solar cybersecurity, but really serve as a framework so you can develop further depending on your situation. I will add, obviously legislation has a very long lasting impact. So this is definitely a big lift, but I think state energy offices and PUCs are the energy experts in your state. So are well positioned to provide that insight on pending legislation or bring this up to the forefront if this is an issue you're looking to pursue further. Next slide. So diving into the content a little bit, this tool highlights 11 pieces of legislation over 9 different states over the last 2 years. So this is relevant stuff. It's not stuff from early 2000s, et cetera. This is here and now. What we found was legislation centers around 4 main areas. The first one being establishing task force and committees. The second one, establishing standards and reporting requirements. The third, expanding open record exemptions to include cyber vulnerabilities. And lastly, directing and authorizing governors and state agencies to prepare for and respond to cyber attacks. And what I want to call out here is, again, these are a framework for you all. As you read through some of the legislation on the right-hand side, and as you go deeper into the tool, you'll read some of this and you might be inspired. So, for example, North Dakota Senate Bill 2313, requiring electric public utilities to report to the Public Service Commission on their cybersecurity preparedness efforts and include how they've assessed. Oh, go back. Sorry about that. Basically, the point being is North Dakota Senate Bill 2313 is encouraging great cyber practice, but there is an opportunity to really nail in solar specific language in that, or DER specific language, or even if this is passed, specifically asking those questions for utilities. Next slide. So all that to say, those are all the 11 tools. Thanks for sticking around. I know that was an overload of information. And I'll show you kind of where you can find them on our website. But the last thing I wanted to cover is a literature review that we have done a couple months ago, but continuing to update it. This kind of provides just another resource separate of the toolkit, provides some relevant reports and research on this issue of solar cybersecurity, breaking down these categories of more introductory resources as well as more advanced resources through categories, as well as breaking it down to things like general cybersecurity resources, DERs, and providing some examples of threat assessment, vulnerabilities, and roadmaps. So I would encourage you guys to do it, look in there. This is obviously not an exhaustive list. And as I mentioned, we're continuing to update it as new resources come out, as this issue continues to develop. Next slide. So before I pass it over to Kirsten to lead us in a question and answer, I wanted to cover all the information that we covered today, from Kirsten's roadmap and all that information on the impetus of the project to Jody, Kirsten, and I going over all the tools can be found on the CATS website. I believe Kirsten put it in the chat earlier, so I would encourage you to do a deeper dive on all the tools. Like I mentioned, there's 11, there's a lot out there, but they're manageable. They're not super long. So I would encourage you to pick and choose maybe which ones are most relevant for your roles and responsibilities as you go through. So I will pass it back to Kirsten. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah and Jody. And I'll invite you to come on the video now as we're going through some of the questions that people have dropped in the chat. And one of the questions is kind of related to the contact slide. So what if there's more information needed? What if states have questions about these tools? How can they go about, obviously they can read them, but is there a way to touch base with NASEO and NARUC to learn more? I don't know, Jody, if you want to speak from the NARUC side.
Absolutely. Our contact information is here. Please reach out to us. I'm sure you guys feel the same way, and whatever we can do to help or get the information for you, we're happy to do that.
I'll also add, certainly reach out to us and we can do a deeper dive. I can spend an hour on each of these tools, so I have plenty of time. But beyond that, another thing we'll offer is we are talking with external groups, trying to get this out there. Obviously, DERs, I think Kirsten touched on, are people are becoming more familiar with them, I think, with a lot of the funding coming down, but solar specific, we're trying to get this message out. So we're doing some briefings with some external organizations. So if maybe that's something you'd be interested in, please let us know.
Right, thank you. And sort of touching up on that too, one of the questions that we received was how, obviously this project might be coming to an end, but from the NARUC and NASEO perspective, how is this going to continue? What are some of the things that both organizations do on solar cybersecurity or DER cybersecurity going forward? So I'll throw it over to Jody first, and I can take the NASEO side, but Jody.
Thank you, Kirsten. So we have an ongoing training program that takes place twice a year, a cybersecurity training. And of course, the DER aspect is one part of it. It's pretty comprehensive. It starts with frameworks and works all the way through a tabletop exercise. So if anybody is interested, it is open to NASEO. It's open to obviously NARUC. So we welcome you. I believe our next session will be held in March. I don't have the firm dates yet, but that's one thing. Another thing that we're working on currently are baselines for cybersecurity for utilities and DERs. And those should be forthcoming. I'm going to say this next month, probably December, will be when it will start being shared. We're still in the process of evaluating. In fact, there's a concurrent meeting that's taking place right now that Lynn's on. That's why she couldn't be here today. But that also establishes baselines for at least what cybersecurity should be in effect for both DERs, for munis, co-ops, as well as the regulated investor-owned utilities. So, and I think I'll stop there and I'll hand it back to you guys.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and for the NASEO side, the state energy offices, I think there's ample opportunity to continue this conversation on DERs and solar cybersecurity. Just like NARUC, we have committees, the Energy Security Committee that touches on a lot of these aspects throughout the year and is very active. We have multiple conferences throughout the year. The annual meeting that just passed in October. The next meeting will be in February. The Energy Policy Outlook conference in February that will provide with opportunities to discuss solar cybersecurity, DR security, so cybersecurity further. I will also say that we are supportive and supporting the state energy offices on developing and continuing to update the state energy security plans. That has been a big focus of the state energy offices on the security side over the last year and continues to be a big focus. So there's certainly an opportunity to integrate some of the things that are discussed in the toolkit into the state energy security plans. And then especially when it comes to exercising, a lot of the state energy offices in conjunction with the PUCs, develop and implement exercises. They work closely with the emergency management agencies on those. So we're hoping and would love to encourage everybody from the state side to integrate some of these scenarios on DER cybersecurity into the exercises, because I think one of the things that is always very, very eye-opening during the exercises is just how much we still are working things out when you actually are in a scenario, and how much there is still to learn when you're actually putting this to practice. So I think that we'll see more exercises centered on cybersecurity in the DER space in particular. And then lastly, I just want to say that we are continuing to hopefully provide opportunities through the committees that I mentioned, but also other forums to really support the state public-private conversation. So this, obviously the state has a role, the federal government has a role, but the private sector certainly has a role too, not just the utilities, but also the solar developers. So really trying to make sure that we can provide a forum from NARUC and NASEO for all these actors to continue these conversations, because I think we all recognize that it will only happen if we all pull in together and have an understanding of each of our roles. Sarah, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I think you covered it in its entirety. Do you have any other questions?
Great. Let me just double check on the question box. And if any other questions from the audience, feel free to throw them into the Q&A box. I'm sure you're all familiar with Zoom these days and how to do that. So I'm just gonna double check and see if I have any other questions, if there are any other questions. I guess the only other questions I see there is that you already covered a little bit, Sarah, but maybe you want to hone in on what kind of opportunities are there from the NASEO-NARUC side to provide a briefing on some of these tools?
As far as opportunities, yeah. So I'll just run you through a little bit. We've already had the opportunity to brief SEA, which the acronym is eluding me. It's leaving my head right now, but energy infrastructures. Anyway, we've had an opportunity to brief some folks, but I've also had the opportunity, Jody gave me the opportunity to talk to specifically some of the PUC at the cybersecurity training in Phoenix, Arizona recently, but whether it's virtual or whether it's in person, we'd love to chat through these as far as not only a briefing of these, but also like technical assistance. We can really break down where it makes sense, depending on the tool, obviously, where it makes sense to pursue which mitigative action, or if you have any questions about the educational resources, would certainly be open to chatting further. And our contact information was on the slide earlier, so please reach out to any of us.
Great. Jody, any final comments?
No, I just want to say thank you for allowing us to co-participate with you guys on this. I think they represent some excellent tools, and hopefully the audience will look into them, and we're happy to help in any way we can. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jody, for joining me in the webinar. And thank you, everybody, for participating. The link to the tools is in the chat, and please do reach out if you have any questions on the tools or any of the information we presented today. So have a great weekend. Thank you very much.